Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Plenary of the 39th Annual World Affairs Conference. I'm your host, Robbie Evans, and today we are joined by our speaker, Mr. Mehrdad Baghai. Mr. Baghai is currently the chairman of Alchemy Growth, a boutique strategy advisory firm based in Ultimo, Australia, where he advises large companies on their growth strategies and business building initiatives. In the past, he has worked as a partner at McKinsey and Company and as the co-leader of the firm's worldwide growth practice. Additionally, Mr. Baghai was the executive director at CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency. Mr. Baghai received um, his education at various top schools, including Harvard and Princeton. In addition to his ample success in education and professionally, Mr. Baghai has an interest and passion for social justice and bettering the world around him. He and his wife, Roha, co-founded the social venture High Results, an organization aimed at educating students about fairness and global citizenship, which has reached over 10,000 students today, all around the world. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. During this fireside chat, we'll have 25 minutes to learn from Mr. Baghai, starting with some questions about his early years as a student. We'll then inquire into his professional life and passions, including the work he does with High Resolves and as an author. And along the way, we'll pick his brain a little bit about his ideas regarding justice and how he sees the world moving towards a brighter future. Um, we hope you enjoy it, and let's get right into the interview. Mr. Baghai, thanks again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us. Just to start things off, I want to actually talk a little bit about your earlier life and education. So please tell us a little bit about your early years. I read that you immigrated to Canada at around the age of 9. How was the transition between the countries? Were there any notable lessons that you learned that still remain with you today, or any experiences, and perhaps inspired your activism work with High Resolves today?
Well, thanks, Robbie. It's great to be with you at this conference. Look, I think it's a great question. I was 9 when my family moved from Iran to Canada, and I grew up in Toronto. The reason we left Iran is that my family, as members of the Baghai faith, which is a persecuted minority in Iran, left because of all the events that were going on. A lot of Baha'is were attacked, even in the lead up to the revolution, and of course, much more so since the revolution. And so as an early part of my growing up, I was exposed to this question of other. Why is it that, otherwise very good people can be taught to hate others? And why would you take this 3% and come up with reasons for hating them? Like whether it's that, oh, they believe men and women are equal, or they don't believe in clergy, or they put science on the same, level as faith. And so those end up being reasons to persecute an entire population, and a large chunk of the majority can be taught to believe that. And of course, arriving in Canada, I barely spoke any English. And my first 4 years before I went to UCC, where I was in public school. What ended up happening was there was, of course, the Iranian Revolution. There was a hostage crisis. And so a lot of my classmates treated me as though I was a terrorist. And I tried to explain that actually I was more like a refugee fleeing from the violence. But, again, I was another. So a lot of my early experiences in life were about how the world creates otherness and uses hate to create division, and that gets in the way of us building a better world.
Wow, that's really interesting. I read online a little bit of when you were talking about a particular instance when, as you mentioned, when you came to Canada, you were familiar with English, but not necessarily all the slang. And there was an immature student in your class who tricked you into cursing at the teacher. That's what I read.
That was my first day in school. I got a detention for using the F word because I didn't know what it meant. And I was told that when teachers call on you, you have to use that word. And so, so yes, I did. The principal was understanding, but felt that given the precedent, I
Yeah.
have to have it attention. But yeah, that was my introduction to classroom.
Wow. I mean, that's unimaginable. Um, when I'm reading about it, I noticed you said, quote, all the shaping events of my life center around injustice. And I mean, I can have it, you've already spoke about it earlier, but um, I mean, that was really interesting to me. I was wondering, can you elaborate on that? And like, were there any other instances, I mean, in addition to the very clear ones you've described, where that was the case too?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting growing up because, you know, the Baha'is in Iran are considered unclean and untouchable, right? So if someone touches you, then their future in heaven is threatened, right? So it's actually quite um, a weird thing to grow up with. But it wasn't. I began to discover that it wasn't just my experience in Iran. I mean, you look at the experience of the African American, the Black population in the U.S. You know, if a Black person would have put her toe in a pool, then in the South, not too many decades ago, they would have drained the pool and not allowed a white person to go in. I mean, it seems crazy to us, but then again, we see signs of similar kind of hate in America today. So these undercurrents have been there, and what the thing that I grew up with, I had parents who, particularly my mother, who really did not allow me to ever feel inferior, but got me to understand that injustices are perpetrated mainly for systemic reasons. You know, people wanting power, people wanting to use populations to achieve certain things. And so they ended up really trying to educate me. My mother, I was very, curious about whether ways of creating equality in society might be more successful. You know, particularly, I was very interested in socialism at 15 when I was at UCC. And my mother took me on a tour of the Eastern Bloc, and so that I could see firsthand what life in some of those countries was like. And so they basically, my education exposed me to a whole bunch of these issues, not just in the classroom, but also through visiting things in life. And I kind of grew up, I think, understanding that I think I wanted society to be better. I didn't want people to be misled, and I thought that it was really important to allow, as we do education, to really push independent thinking and to allow people to learn how to ask questions. I think it's a lot harder for your generation than it was for mine, Robbie, because I think fake news and social media have made it incredibly difficult to tell truth from falsehood. And so it's a lot easier to mislead large numbers of people with falsehoods. And the results can be quite traumatic for individuals and for society. And so I think that the sorts of things that got me interested in this space are even more important today than they were when I was your age.
Wow, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things to touch upon. One thing I found particularly fascinating was your mother, who helped, as you mentioned, helped you maintain pride and understand you were not inferior to anyone else. Um, Throughout your life, you've very clearly been able to maintain that positive outlook. But what helped you do that in such difficult situations? And why was it so important?
Um, well, I mean, I think a lot of the credit goes to my mother, but I think also, UCC is an amazing place. It was in my time as well. I mean, there's always warts, but it was a place where if you were passionate about something, you would get the resources to pursue it. I really wanted to create a science magazine when I was at UCC. I mean, it's kind of interesting that later in life I ended up helping to run a science agency, a national science agency. But so we created something called Probe, which was the UCC Journal of Science. And the school gave resources. In those days, we used to, the printing was done by hand and various other things. But we created a magazine and we would distribute it in the school. And so I think being in an educational environment where you could go from an idea to reality is really, really important. I think what I've learned since about learning science is it's one thing to, understand new theories and even practice them in the classroom. But unless you get to apply them in some way in the real world, you don't develop the confidence you need to do it in day-to-day life. And I think that's one of the things about my early years in my education was it gave me a lot of confidence to push my own ideas. And a lot of my mentors, actually, one of my favorite quotes that I came across when I was 15. I was just actually interviewed on a podcast a couple of weeks ago. They said, "What's your favorite quote?" I was referring to it. It's all about questioning laws of society and saying, if doctrines are not really safeguarding the interests of the majority of humankind, then they should be swept away. And so in those early years, 15, 16, I learned to question orthodoxy. I learned to think for myself. And the more I read, the more I saw, the more I did, the more confidence I began to get in my ability uh, to be myself and to think for myself and to put ideas forth.
That's really interesting. I'm just thinking. I mean, it certainly is a very relevant problem where it seems because of so many falsehoods, all the information people have access to, people all around the world are living in different realities, which can lead to a lot of conflict, a lot of problems. Particularly, I'm thinking about the U.S. recently, but it's very general. You mentioned how, yeah, in your experience, that's really interesting. I think it definitely came down to your education, to your curiosity to really learn, read, to really understand the truth. But how do you think people can overcome the challenges that you mentioned of our generation, especially with social media, all of the added challenge? Um, I talk a little bit about how things have changed and how those obstacles can maybe be overcome.
Well, I think your wording was really perfect, Robbie. Different realities. So when I went to the Kennedy School at Harvard, which is a school of public policy. And, one of the interesting things about that education, whatever, 35 years ago, was that you understood that there was a shared fact base. And then what you debated were opinions about what do you do with respect to those facts. And I think what's changed in society is that people are now comfortable just accepting their own set of facts. That facts are like opinions. You can decide which group you accept and which groups of facts you want to ignore. And so essentially we have groups of the population that can live in their own reality. And when you live in your own reality, then narratives can be really shaped to suit that reality and to get you to undertake in activities that you wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, in the U.S., you can see how a positioning of reality with respect to the election has gotten a lot of people to believe that it was a false election, and that has led to all kinds of actions in terms of what in their opinion is a defense of the Constitution. But essentially, the two sides are living in different worlds. And so the debate is not so much a debate of policy, it's just a conflicting set of realities. That's a very difficult world compared to the one I grew up in, and so part of what I think we have to do is, when I guess we'll talk about it a bit, is in our educational processes, we have to arm people. We have to train people so that they don't become victims of this kind of manipulation. And I don't mean to, say that the manipulation is only by one side. I think that the kind of manipulation of truth is happening on a very wide scale by a large number of parties. And so well-intentioned people around the world need to make sure that the mass of humankind has the ability to see through false narratives. They have the ability to ask questions, to think for themselves, and not to fall victim to mass manipulation.
Wow, I have to say, you're helping me so much with my theory of knowledge course. Was that around when you were at UCC too?
No, we did. Well,
Yeah.
no, we didn't have a theory of knowledge class. We did study Latin, uh, which uh,
Oh,
which was fantastic. But no,
yeah,
no theory
but
of knowledge.
it's exactly what we're talking about. What makes knowledge? How can we know the truth? And it's really interesting. Um, but about, I want to talk more a little bit about kind of the education piece, and maybe this is a nice transition into your work with high results. And I was wondering, first of all, can you just tell us a little bit about your organization? What is its primary mission, and what, if you haven't already touched on it, what led you to co-found the organization with your wife?
About 15 years ago, my wife Roya and I were thinking about how we give back to society, and we looked at various possibilities, and we ended up really deciding that we wanted to focus our giving in the education space for a lot of the reasons we've just been talking through.
Mm.
And We remembered that when I was a grad student at Harvard, I had used these simulations to do research on human choice. But one of the things that we discovered quite, fortuitously was that although these games were designed for research, when people played these simulations, when they played these games, it actually changed the way they thought about the world. They were more likely to act in the long-term collective interest than in their own short-term personal interest. And I ended up really becoming fascinated by that because so much of what's going on in society is this um, acting in your own self-interest. You look at this topic today of vaccine nationalism, which is around wealthy countries, including Canada, stockpiling vaccines in multiples of their population size, whereas other countries just don't have vaccines. For example, Panama has 12,000 vaccines, I think. So the challenge is that with the vaccine, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Because if there's large parts of the population that remain unvaccinated, that gives a grounding, a bedding for the virus to mutate. And the mutations may not be able to be fought off by existing vaccines. You might need to change vaccines and revaccinate to handle that. And so here we have, a country acting what it thinks is its national interest, but it's actually creating a dangerous macro outcome, which is worse for the entire world. And we should be doing everything we can to vaccinate every single person on the planet as quickly as we possibly can, and starting with the ones that are at most risk of transmitting. Climate change is no different. It's another collective action problem, right? Countries that think, okay, I'm just like Australia thinks we're 1.3% of the global emissions. What difference does that make? Well, if every country thinks it's only contributing a little bit, then everyone contributes a lot, and you get the kind of climate disaster we're heading towards. So what I began to realize was that there are a vast number of these collective action problems, and we needed a systematic way to get a critical mass of society to think in the long-term collective interest. And that's how and why we created High Resolves. And our aim, we talk about the purpose of the organization, is to activate human responsibility. But what we mean by those three words, activating human responsibility, is getting people to wake up to how their own choices, their own decisions affect the collective outcome. The only challenge being for them to not think that they're insignificant, it doesn't matter, but to realize that you need billions of people to realize that their actions make a difference to actually be able to change these problems. So that's why we created High Resolves about 15 years ago. You mentioned 10,000, which is the number that we have in US and Canada. Overall, globally, we've actually put 500,000 students through the program in one way or another. And the program's going quite fast. And we typically try to embed in schools, including UCC, a series of learning experiences that get, usually from grade 7 to about grade 10, that get people to really think about their own identity, recognize themselves as part of a single shared humanity, develop some independent thinking skills so they can identify dogma and propaganda and things like that, and immunize themselves against hateful messaging and divisive messaging. And then also develop the understanding of the injustices that are in the world and what they need to do to help create a more progressive, inclusive, just world, all along questioning their own choices and their day-to-day lives. That's what the program's about. And really, I think it is an indispensable part of education, right? Like numeracy and literacy. And this kind of citizenship education, if you want to call it that, is a really critical part of what we need to do.
Wow, that's really interesting. I know that at the prep we had the program, they were really lucky to have it. And I was speaking with some people who had great feedback. It was a part of their exhibition. I think we have time for just one more question, unfortunately, but I found that really interesting what you were mentioning about um, the importance of seeking, yeah, a global kind of the common good, and it's especially relevant in terms of vaccines. I haven't, just to bring up very briefly a question about your book. I haven't been able to read it. I've only started, and I know that this is sorry, your book, As One: Individual Action, Collective Power. I believe that it was got directed particularly towards, I think, leaders of business. I think, right? But I read in the preface that you said our world is as much about cooperation as it is about conflict, as much about collaboration as it is competition. Um, do you think that that also applies, as you've mentioned, outside of perhaps like the leadership space in a company, for example? Um, in a society in Canada, I think that is very individualistic. Um, what are what do you think? I guess my question is, what are the pros and cons regarding cooperation and competition? As I imagine, they both have some value, and where do you see the best balance between the two?
Yeah, I tend not to think of them as it's a bit of a false dichotomy. There are elements of both all the time. And I think there's a degree of healthy competition. It can become ruinous if you take it to an extreme. And I think collaboration is also incredibly useful. But there are times where if you want the style of group behavior needs to be a little bit more directed. Let's say, for example, a fire alarm goes off. You're not going to sit there and brainstorm different ways of leaving the building. You're going to follow the instructions of the fire ward. And so it's understanding what forms of collective behavior apply best in different situations. That's really where it's at. And I think maybe, Robbie, coming back to the state of the world that we're in. For me, over the last week, I had the privilege of participating in the World Economic Forum and the discussions that were going on by world leaders and corporate leaders. And one of the themes that hit me very clearly across this week was that I think the leadership challenge that we have now, and that applies whether you're a CEO, a leader of a country, leader of a school, but even in a family setting. But the challenge we have is that the next year or so, the short term, is dark. I don't mean just the issues with COVID and the pandemic. Of course, that's there, but there's all kinds of other things, the racial reckoning, what's happening with climate, the growing inequality that is being exacerbated by the pandemic, and even economic imbalances in the world. There's a lot of things that give us concern. And so the short-term outlook is dark. It is not a positive environment. The challenge we have of leadership is something that others can look up called the Stockdale paradox, by Jim Collins. But it's really this idea that you have to be honest about what's going on in the short term, because people need to have the resilience to make it through the short term. You also have to really inspire people about what's possible in the medium to long term, because they have to have that hope. They have to have an inspired belief that a better future is possible. Otherwise, they won't engage in the collective action that's required to create that future. And so where we're at with humanity right now is we can lose all confidence. We can, back to that discussion, we can lose all sense of belief in ourselves, in our world. And if we do, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the future will not be a pleasant one. On the other hand, we can be realistic about what's going on in the world, but stick to the things that give us hope. They give us a sense that society can be reborn, that we can flourish, we can have unity and diversity, we can behave as though we're a single human family. And in doing so, do the sorts of things we all need to do to make that actually happen. I think that's the task of leadership today.
Wow, Mr. Baghai, thank you so much once again. I'm sure, I mean, I have my own questions. I'm sure all the audience members do too, but you've given us so much to think about already. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But I just want to say, like, we really appreciate, thank you so much for talking with us. I'm sure we'll make for some great conversation between attendees in the future and with their families.
Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you so
I wish I could have been there in person, but the world doesn't allow it. Can I just tell you that your research and preparing for the interview was first rate. Thank you for taking the time to study.
No worries. Thank you so much. Just a final announcement for all of the attendees. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you'd complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. Take a look back at it. There's a lot of content to consider. And so for the rest of the day, just please navigate to your links on worldaffairs.ucc.on.ca and attend your following events. Immediately following this plenary at 10:20, we are hosting a networking session on Zoom. This is an opportunity for you to meet other participants and bond over fun prompts and breakout rooms. Please refer to your personal schedule on WAC website for all the Zoom links. On behalf of WAC and our presenters, thank you so much, Mr. Baghai. Thank you to everybody who's attended today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.